Hey everyone, back again in my living room, again with my trusty mug. And so we are here to talk about hydrocolloids this time. So hydrocolloids are a bit complex, so I want to just give a few more learning objectives this time around. So number one, what are hydrocolloids? We talked last time about what fiber is. So what are hydrocolloids? There are a number of different examples. We're not going to exhaust all of them by far, but just to give you a few major examples: Carrageenans and the related Alginates, Galactomannans, Pectins, and then we'll look at it. We'll look a bit on the label and how these things appear, as well as discuss a bit about the viscosity measurements that you're going to be taking in lab. All right, let's get started. So hydrocolloids. So the word really means hydro, of course, meaning water. It means water glue, and typically we're talking about big molecules that help hold water together in different ways, thickening, gelling, these kind of things. And so you can see by that definition, we're trying to produce some type of suspension thickening effect. We're trying to stabilize emulsions. Typically, we're not trying to actually emulsify. That's a property of mostly lipids or proteins. There is one exception that we'll mention, but for the most part, we're stabilizing emulsions by making the system thicker. We're not actually emulsifying per se. And these hydrocolloids are defined by what they do, not where they're from. The reason being that most of the hydrocolloids we're going to discuss, at least in this lesson, are plant-based, but there are hydrocolloids that are proteins. And so when we get to proteins, we'll discuss more about that and how this all fits together, but just realize that these are really defined by their function. Okay, so let's talk about specifically non-starch polysaccharide hydrocolloids, just to narrow it down a bit. And one of the best examples to do that would be the Carrageenans. Carrageenans are really diverse in terms of the types of molecules that are formed. These are all seaweed-derived molecules, but you can see that there is alpha-carrageenan and beta-carrageenan and lambda-carrageenan. There's all types of many different types of carrageenan. In the food industry, we're only focused on just a couple based on their functionality for our purposes. But if you look closely at these molecules, you can see that they vary in terms of their side groups in the degree to which they possess sulfate groups. So they're built around galactose in terms of the sugar, and these are beta 1,4 linked. They can be linked in various ways, but they're all built around galactose and these different types of linkages and different degrees of sulfation. So the ones that we deal with in foods primarily are going to be Kappa, Iota, and Lambda Carrageenan. So these are the ones that we focus on primarily. And Kappa Carrageenan is interesting in the sense that we can make either weak gels out of it, a weak network that can trap water, or we can make a strong gel out of it, depending on how we treat this and what we introduce into the mix. So Carrageenan, if we heat it and then allow it to cool, we'll start forming helices, and this can form weak gels this way. But if we add in potassium, then we can get bridges across those helices and make a much stronger type of a gel. Again, we're taking advantage of those negatively charged sulfate groups. We put a positive charge in there, and we're able to draw some of these random coils, or helices rather, together. Kappa Carrageenan is used to make super weak gels in chocolate milk. So it's meant to suspend those chocolate particles, which otherwise would just float right to the bottom, um, and so you've probably had that experience if you just made something like Nestle Quick, which is just basically cocoa and sugar. You stir, 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 and if you let it sit, then all that chocolate, those chocolate particles or cocoa particles, settle to the bottom. In the case of most commercial chocolate milks, you have Carrageenan as part of a system that holds these materials up in suspension and doesn't let them fall to the bottom. So Kappa versus Iota Carrageenan. Kappa works with potassium as the ion that will help create a gel, and then Iota primarily works with calcium. So of course, calcium being divalent, calcium can actually make bridges using both of its charges, can make bridges across these helices, and so it produces a more elastic gel, whereas Kappa produces a more brittle type of gel. All right, alginates are closely related. They're from algae. They're from and you can see that the structure looks somewhat similar to Carrageenan, but now we're using different types of sugars. So mannose and glucose in terms of the particular type of sugar. These also have different charges on them, and so you can see the carboxylic acid side groups. What that allows us to do is to make an instant gel by doing the following. So we actually disperse the alginate material into water, and then we add a source of calcium. And when we do that, we make bridges, and those bridges immediately form gels. And depending on the strength of the concentration of the alginate and the calcium, we can make either very weak gels or very strong gels, but it happens instantaneously. All right, so let's talk about the Galactomannans. Mannose and galactose make up what we call Guar gum, and so you can see that this is a beta bonded molecule, and we have a number of side groups attached here as well. So mannose and galactose forming this one, you start to see the diversity now of the sugars that are used in these hydrocolloids versus just glucose in say starch, or glucose as a basis for cellulose. Now we're getting into mixes of different types of sugars. So it's beta 1,4 linked mannose, and then you have galactose every second mannose. So the idea then is that this one is cold water hydrating. That's good for instant type of applications, and it produces an extremely high viscosity per unit weight. So you don't have to add very much to get a lot of thickness, and then it also can produce this kind of slimy characteristic, and can be used for that reason as a fat replacer. One of the things that we'll hear about is hairy or smooth types of polymers, and this is really referring to polymers with or without a lot of side groups. So in locust bean gum, one of the ways that we refer to this, locust bean gum is another galactomannan like guar gum. We refer to it as hairy or smooth. And the idea is that the hairy ones have more of these side groups, the smooth ones have fewer of them. This thing, as opposed to guar gum, must be heated before it will be soluble, and the idea is that the smooth regions can interact with other polysaccharides and proteins. So you often see it in things like ice cream, because it will interact with the proteins in the ice cream and help stabilize it. So it's often a part of what we just generally refer to as stabilizers in ice cream. All right, And so here's just an example where we see the sugars as side chains, kind of represented just by this straight line with these other vertical lines, the vertical lines being the side chains. So the smooth part is where you don't see any vertical lines, and then the vertical lines are the hairy portions. This is the part that would not interact with polysaccharides or proteins. So pectin is a pretty familiar hydrocolloid, and we know that pectin is used frequently to make jellies and jams and marmalades and these type of things. Pectin is built on galactose and pyranosyluronic acid. So you see that we have galactose as our base sugar. We have beta bonding, like we do for the other types of non-starch polysaccharides. Uronic acid is the side chain, or methyl esters of uronic acid. So the idea then is that pectin, depending on what type of pectin you want, works in different ways. So some pectins need sugar to gel, and this is part of the reason why we add so much sugar to certain jellies and jams, not just for sweetness, but to make it gel. And then others need no sugar whatsoever. So we'll explain those differences. If we're talking about a pectin that we want to set very rapidly, then we want methyl esters. We want percent methyl esters with carboxyl groups about 70% or greater than 70%, versus slow set, which we want about 50%. The idea with these is that we want lots of sugar, and the sugar is really designed to bind water, as we know sugar can do, based on our colligative properties discussion. So the idea of sugar is to bind that water, and then combining that with a relatively low pH for both of those, what we get is something where where we'll have protonated uronic acids, and then we're able to get some hydrogen bonding, and that will occur more strongly when water is partly taken out of the picture by sugar, and that's why we add so much. So we get strong interactions, making a network that ultimately produces a gel when we trap water inside of it. So that's the rapid and slow set. Low methoxyl pectin, on the other hand, doesn't have as many of these groups, and it relies on cross-linking, as we saw with alginates. We can, if we have one molecule over here which is negatively charged and another molecule over here which is negatively charged, if we put a calcium between those two, then that calcium will bridge those two molecules. And this is exactly how jellies and jams, which are sugar-free, those that are designed for individuals with diabetes or other issues related to that don't allow them to consume sugar, this is exactly how these are produced. And it produces a bit of a different type of gel than a typical sugar-based marmalade or jelly. So you'll see it's a bit more brittle, just a different type of a texture. But all of these are pectin. Pectin is not just one monolithic thing, but many different types of things that we use for primarily gelling purposes. All right. So we've already discussed those mechanisms, and I had personal experience with this last time we made strawberry jam, and my jam didn't gel fully, and you can see all the sugar that we had waiting to add to these strawberries. It didn't gel fully, even though we added a little bit of pectin to it, and it was actually the slow set pectin, but it had plenty of those functional groups that would have worked, but we simply didn't even with all that sugar, didn't add enough sugar to get it to gel properly. So next time, of course, we'll have to add a bit more sugar to make it gel. But as is, it's a bit liquid, and it pours nicely over pancakes. So we use it for that purpose. All right, this hydrocolloid is a bit out of the ordinary because it actually is a combination of two sugars, arabinose and ribose, and then also protein. So this is a quite complex type of an interaction. And as you can see, it dissolves in hot or cold water. You're starting to see this repeat a bit. Often we're interested in hydrocolloids, non-starch type hydrocolloids that are soluble in cold water or don't require a lot of work to solubilize. It doesn't produce a lot of viscosity, but it's quite soluble, and it's used in different types of materials to inhibit sugar crystallization. So it can get in the way of sugars combining to form larger and larger crystals, and so you might see that again in ice cream to prevent things like formation of lactose crystals, because of course there's plenty of milk sugar in ice cream in addition to the other sugars we add, and you can get some lactose crystals if you don't prevent them in some way. So you can use it as well in soft drinks, and it helps stabilize flavor emulsions. Many times the flavors that are present in soft drinks are fat soluble. In other words, a soft drink is mostly water. Those flavors would rise right up to the top and just float on the top if you didn't have something in there that kept them somehow suspended. So it allows those flavors to stay suspended until you drink the soda. All right. So the idea is that because it incorporates proteins as well as these other more traditional hydrocolloids, non-starch polysaccharides, this can act as a true emulsifier. So it can do what other protein and lipid systems do and truly emulsify emulsified materials. So functionality of hydrocolloids, it's pretty diverse. You can form sols, as we discussed, the idea of just stabilizing large molecules in a type of suspension. You can thicken, you can make gels, you can stabilize emulsions. Typically, you're not making them. We were mentioning this this exception in terms of the gum arabic, right? So that was the exception to the rule. But typically, you're thickening, not truly making an emulsion, because for the most part, these non-starch polysaccharides don't have protein as part of their makeup. They can stabilize foams for similar reasons as they stabilize emulsions, because they thicken the entire system. You can make different types of films and coatings out of them, gel caps if you're thinking about pharmaceutical applications. You can replace fat because you can make a sort of a slimy, slippery sensation on your tongue, and that feels like fat to some degree. And these are also, as you saw from FDA's considerations in our fiber lesson, some of them considered to be dietary fiber, and will probably be included on the list in the near future, and may have implications for heart health, for diabetes, and for other things. But quite a few different levels of functionality for hydrocolloids. All right, so in lab you're going to be working with the Brookfield viscometer. This is the go-to instrument for measuring viscosity. The way that it works, as you can see, is that it looks a bit like a stick blender. It has a spinning metal disc, and that metal disc will go into a beaker with liquids at various thicknesses, and it spins. And the resistance that disc experiences as it spins in that liquid is how the viscosity is measured, and is typically measured in centipoise. So in the lab, you'll be considering different ways in which to to look at fluids, whether they're shear thickening, Newtonian, or shear thinning. The idea then being that Newtonian fluids, like water, are those where, as we apply a greater and greater shear rate, in other words, the faster and faster that you stir, we'll see that the viscosity itself doesn't really increase with that shear rate. Whereas with shear thickening, as you might expect, the viscosity does increase, and with shear thinning, the viscosity actually decreases. So there are different types of materials. You may be familiar with oobleck, or oobleck, however you pronounce it, cornstarch type of material that's shear thickening. So the higher the shear rate, that you place on it, the greater the viscosity you'll get. Shear thinning, things like yogurt or ketchup, if you have them sitting still, they can be quite thick materials, but if you shake them, they will thin out and become almost watery. And shear thinning is also a capacity for many types of biological materials, including blood, so it will tend to thin out as you increase the shear rate. Here's another way of looking at the same thing, so I don't want you to be confused by these two different graphs. They're showing slightly different perspectives. So shear rate, again, how fast you stir is what's on the x-axis. Shear stress, that's how much pressure needs to be applied. Shear stress is related to this degree of pressure that you're applying, and how much deformation that you're going to be getting. So the idea then is that as you increase shear rate, that shear stress for Newtonian fluids is going to increase in a linear fashion. But for other types of fluids, for the pseudoplastic fluids, where they're going to be shear thinning, then as you increase shear rate, that shear stress is actually going to not increase at a linear rate. In other words, things are going to thin out as you apply more, as you apply a higher shear rate to them. Dilatant or shear thickening materials, you'll have to apply more stress to get them to move at the same shear rate. So that's the idea that this is trying to communicate. The Bingham plastics, those actually have what we call a yield stress. So at first they don't move at all, and then once they get moving, Bingham plastics can act more or less like Newtonian fluids. They will increase in shear stress as we increase shear rate in a linear fashion. Bingham pseudoplastics, again, have a yield stress, but once that yield stress is reached, we've put a certain amount of stress on them and they start to move, then the faster and faster we stir or get them to try to move, the easier it is, basically, the thinner that they become, but after that yield stress has passed. All right, so those are a couple of things that you'll encounter in lab. I highly encourage you to check out this YouTube video for the Brookfield. It's about 20 minutes, but again, you can put it on higher speeds to speed it up. It's a really, really good explanation of how this instrument works. So, I would encourage you, if you have any questions, to consider looking at that video. All right, last few things here for hydrocolloids. Let's look at the labels for a few foods. If you look at bread, you'll see a whole lot of hydrocolloids. You'll see flour, and you'll see added gluten, protein, of course, not a starch or not a polysaccharide. You'll see fiber added in there as well. So we just finished talking about fiber in our previous lesson, and you'll see guar gum. So all these different hydrocolloids in this same system that we call bread. Of course, this is a type of bread which is designed to sit on the shelf or in your cabinet for a considerable period of time, maybe a week or two, rather than the bread you might purchase at an artisan shop, which is really supposed to be used the day of or the day after, and then that's it. So hydrocolloids help with extending the usable shelf life of bread and the texture that we get out of it, as well as some of the health properties, of course. things like fiber that are added to bread for that purpose. When you're talking about gluten-free products, you will see a lot of hydrocolloids. The reason is when you go gluten-free, right? We saw bread has gluten added in this in the previous case, but if you go gluten-free, then you lose what gluten does. It really provides a very flexible framework that allows for the trapping of air bubbles as yeast produce that, and you're making bread and it's rising. When you lose that by way of getting rid of the gluten, then what you have to do is have a mix of materials that simulate what gluten does. And this is what we see, is this mixture of xanthan gum, CMC, agar, many different types of materials in order to try to get that type of texture. So here is the gluten-free crust that's sold at Whole Foods, and you can see that they're using different types of starches and flours, so tapioca, white bean, sorghum, xanthan gum, and gelatin, all put together in there to try to hold this crust together in a way that wheat gluten would have done. All right, so just highlighting those hydrocolloids. Just wanted to provide this illustration. This is another way of looking at the carbohydrate family tree, and the idea that we have many different sources for the hydrocolloids that we use, and some of them are exudates. You would take a tree and score it, and that would be sap or something that would come out. You can get this from seeds. You can get this from microbes. In some cases, gelatin or caseinates, you can get it from animal products, but most of the time we're talking about plants. And then there are many different types of cellulose type derivations, modified polysaccharides, and then pure chemical compounds that we look to get hydrocolloids. So this is a very diverse group of compounds. If you look at the carbohydrate family tree, we have discussed simple carbs, we've discussed oligosaccharides, we've discussed polysaccharides. So we're getting there, and so we have a few more things to discuss, but we're closing in on finishing up with all the exam-related material, and so I encourage you to submit any questions you have to the forum on Moodle. All right. Well, a few take-homes for hydrocolloids, and we're finished. One, the idea that hydrocolloids are defined by function, not origin. So we can have protein-based hydrocolloids, seeds, exudates, all these different types of sources, but it's really about what they do. Do they gel? Do they thicken? Do they thicken a little bit? Are they cold water soluble, hot water soluble? How do they work? And thickening and gelling are really the primary functions of these things, although there are others, as we mentioned. There are very commonly used across many food types, especially things like gluten-free products, as we saw with the Whole Foods pizza label. All right, well, that's it for this lesson, and look forward to talking with you again. See you later.